The boss shoved Dean a second time, and Dean stumbled backward but didn't fall. The boss pressed his finger into Dean's chest and said, "Move or I'll move you." Dean answered, "No, you won't." And 60 people watched the two of them stand chest to chest, neither one moving, neither one breathing. Wait, because what Dean said in the next 10 seconds stopped the boss cold, but it got Dean blacklisted by every major operator in Vegas. And when Frank found out 3 days later, he said something to Dean that made Dean cry for the first time in his life. The room was supposed to be private. That's what the invitation said. Private party, closed ballroom, top floor of the Stardust, February 1962. No press, no cameras, just 60 people who mattered in Vegas. Casino managers, entertainment directors, a few high rollers, and the men who made sure everyone played by the rules nobody wrote down. Frank Sinatra was supposed to sing 3 songs, Dean Martin was supposed to crack a few jokes, and everyone was supposed to go home with a good story and no problems. That's how these things worked. Frank had done a dozen of them. Dean had done more. The stage wasn't really a stage, just a small platform at the front of the room with a microphone stand and a piano. The lighting was soft, amber, the kind that made everyone look good in their tuxedos and evening gowns. Waiters moved between tables with champagne and whiskey, their shoes silent on the thick carpet. Cigarette smoke hung in the air under the chandeliers, and when Frank took the microphone, the room settled into the comfortable hum of people who knew they were in the right place at the right time. Frank opened with, "I've got you under my skin," smooth and easy, and the crowd leaned back in their chairs. Dean stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, watching. He wasn't scheduled to sing for another 20 minutes. He was just there, the way he always was when Frank performed. Close enough to step in if something went sideways, far enough back to let Frank own the room. That's how they worked. That's how they'd always worked. Frank finished the song and got his applause. Then he shifted into the patter, the jokes, the little asides that made a performance feel like a conversation. He talked about the flight in, about the hotel, about the guy at the craps table who thought he could beat the house with a system. The room laughed. Frank grinned. He was rolling. Then he looked toward the back of the room, toward the table in the corner where a man in a dark suit sat alone. And Frank said, "You know, some people come to Vegas to gamble. Some people come to Vegas to make sure you lose." The room laughed, but not as loud. A few people glanced at the back table. The man in the dark suit didn't move. His face didn't change. He just sat there, one hand on his glass, the other resting on the table. Frank didn't seem to notice. He kept going. "I'm serious," he said. "This guy's got a system, too. It's called, I own the building." Bigger laugh this time. A couple people clapped. Dean shifted his weight. He wasn't smiling anymore. Notice something about Dean's face in that moment, because most people in the room were watching Frank. But if you'd looked at Dean, you would have seen his jaw tighten just slightly, and his eyes flicked toward the back table and then back to Frank. He didn't move. He didn't say anything, but his hands came out of his pockets. Frank did the second joke 30 seconds later. He said, "You ever notice how some guys walk into a room and everybody gets real polite real fast? Like they're carrying an invisible sign that says, 'Be nice or else.'" He paused. "I think our friend back there lost his sign. Somebody find it for him." The room went quiet for half a second, then a few people laughed, nervous and short. The man at the back table set his glass down, slowly, carefully. Then he stood up. When his jacket opened, the room saw what was on his belt. Not everyone, but enough people. A woman at the table nearest to him touched her husband's arm. A waiter stopped mid-pour and stepped back. The man didn't say anything. He just started walking toward the stage. His shoes made no sound on the carpet, but you could feel each step in the way the room changed. Conversation stopped. People turned in their seats. The piano player's hands hesitated over the keys. Frank saw him coming. You could tell by the way his smile stayed frozen for just a beat too long, the way his hand tightened around the microphone. But he didn't step back. He didn't apologize. He just stood there and waited. Dean didn't wait. He moved. 3 steps forward, fast but not running, and he put himself directly between Frank and the man in the dark suit. The microphone was still in Frank's hand. The man was still walking. Dean was in the middle. The first shove came hard and sudden. The man's hands hit Dean's chest, and Dean went back 2 steps, his heels catching on the edge of the platform. He didn't fall. He straightened up, adjusted his tie with one hand, and didn't move. The man stepped closer. "You're in my way," he said. His voice was low, calm, almost polite. Dean said, "I know." The man shoved him again, harder this time. Dean stumbled backward into the microphone stand, and it clanged against the floor. Frank reached out to steady him, but Dean waved him off. He stepped forward again, back to the same spot, and this time he was close enough to the man that their chests were almost touching. The man pressed his finger into Dean's sternum, right over his heart, and leaned in. "Move," he said, "or I'll move you." 60 people were watching. Nobody was drinking. Nobody was breathing. Dean looked the man in the eye and said, "No, you won't. Stop for a second and picture the room from above, because what you're about to see only makes sense when you understand who was sitting where." Frank Sinatra behind Dean, microphone in his hand, face pale under the stage. Lights. The man in the dark suit in front of Dean, finger still pressed to his chest, jaw set. Dean in the middle, tuxedo slightly wrinkled from the shoves, breathing slow and steady. And around them, 60 people frozen at their tables, waiting to see if someone was about to die. Dean leaned in, close enough that only the man could hear him, and he whispered something. 3 words, maybe 4. Nobody else heard it. The room was silent except for the low hum of the ventilation and the distant sound of slot machines from the casino floor below. The man's face didn't change, but his hand dropped. He stepped back, just 1 step. Then he looked past Dean at Frank and he said, "You and me, back room, 2 minutes." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked toward the side door near the bar. The door closed behind him. Dean didn't turn around. He stood there for a moment, hands at his sides. Then he looked back at Frank. Frank's mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. Dean said, "Finish the set." Frank said, "Dean, what did you—" Dean cut him off. "Finish the set, Francis. I'll handle this." He walked off the platform and followed the man through the side door. It closed behind him with a soft click. Frank stood there with the microphone. The room was still silent. A woman coughed. Someone's chair scraped against the floor. Frank cleared his throat and said, "Well, that was exciting." A few people laughed, but it sounded wrong, thin and hollow. Frank looked at the piano player and nodded. The piano player started playing "The Way You Look Tonight," and Frank started singing, but his voice was shaking and everyone could hear it. Look at what Frank didn't see while he was singing, because back in that side room, Dean was standing across from the man in the dark suit, and there was a desk between them and a single lamp and nothing else. The man sat down in the chair behind the desk. Dean stayed standing. The man said, "You know who I am." It wasn't a question. Dean said, "Yeah." The man said, "Then you know I don't forget." Dean nodded. The man leaned back in his chair and looked at Dean for a long time, and then he said, "Your buddy out there just made a very expensive mistake." Dean didn't say anything. The man continued, "He thinks he's untouchable because he's got a name and a microphone. He's wrong. You know he's wrong." Dean said, "He was drunk. He didn't mean it." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I don't care what he meant. I care what he said. In front of 60 people. You understand what that does to me if I let it slide?" Dean said, "Yeah, I understand." The man said, "Good. So here's how this works. You want me to forget what happened out there. You give me something I want more." Dean's hands were steady, but his jaw was working. He said, "What do you want?" The man said, "You're opening a club next month. The Carousel. I know the investors. I know the numbers. I want in. 20%. Silent partner. No questions." Dean stared at him. The Carousel was his. He'd been planning it for 2 years, scraped together every favor and every dollar he had to make it happen. It was going to be the first thing that was completely his. No Rat Pack, no Frank, no Capitol Records. Just his name on the door and his rules inside. 20% meant giving up control. It meant this man had a say in everything. It meant Dean would never really own it. The man watched Dean's face and said, "You got 10 minutes to decide. After that, I walk out there and your buddy learns what happens when you disrespect people who matter." He looked at his watch. Dean looked at the door. He could hear Frank singing through the wall, the sound muffled and distant. He thought about Frank out there, trying to hold the room together, not knowing what was happening back here. He thought about the carousel, the plans, the blueprints, the dream. He thought about what the man said. 10 minutes. Remember that Dean had a rule about decisions. If you can't walk away from it, it's not really yours. He'd said that to Frank once, years ago, after a bad contract negotiation. Frank had asked him what he meant. Dean said, "If they own you, you can't say no. And if you can't say no, you're not free." Frank had laughed and said Dean was being dramatic. Dean hadn't been dramatic. He'd been right. Dean looked at the man and said, 15%, and you stay out of the hiring. The man said, 20, and I approve the entertainment. Dean said, 18 and you get veto rights, not approval. The man smiled. 19, final offer. Dean didn't move for a long time. Then he said, done. The man stood up and extended his hand. Dean shook it. The man said, smart choice. Your buddy lives. The carousel opens. Everybody's happy. He walked to the door, opened it, and left. Dean stood there alone in the room with the single lamp and the desk and the sound of Frank still singing through the wall. When Dean walked back into the ballroom, Frank was finishing The Lady is a Tramp. The crowd applauded, relieved and grateful that the night was continuing, that nothing terrible had happened. Dean slipped back onto the platform and took the second microphone. Frank glanced at him, eyebrows raised, a silent question. Dean gave him a small nod. Frank exhaled and smiled, the first real smile since the man had stood up. They finished the show together, trading lines on Me and My Shadow, and the room loved it. By the end of the night, people were talking about how smooth they were, how professional, how nothing ever rattled them. Nobody asked Dean what happened in the back room. Nobody asked the man in the dark suit why he left early. The party ended at midnight. Frank and Dean walked out together down the hallway toward the elevators. Frank said, "What'd you say to him?" Dean said, "I told him you were an idiot and he should ignore you." Frank laughed. "Seriously, what'd you say?" Dean said, "Handled it. Don't worry about it." Frank stopped walking. "Dean, come on. What did you give him?" Dean pressed the elevator button and said, "Nothing I can't afford to lose." That was a lie, but Frank didn't know it yet. Listen to what happened 3 days later, because that's when Frank found out. He was having breakfast at the Sands with Sammy Davis Jr. when a guy Frank knew from the Entertainment Commission sat down at their table. The guy said, "Congratulations on the carousel. Dean's really doing something special." Frank looked at Sammy. Sammy shrugged. Frank said, "What are you talking about?" The guy said, "You didn't hear? Dean signed the final partnership papers yesterday. Brought in a new investor. Big money. Silent partner. Guys connected, if you know what I mean." Frank felt something cold drop into his stomach. He said, "Who's the partner?" The guy said a name. Frank knew the name. It was the man from the party, the man in the dark suit, the man Frank had made jokes about. Frank stood up so fast his chair fell over. He left the table, didn't say goodbye, didn't pay for breakfast. He went straight to the Stardust up to Dean's floor and knocked on the door. Dean didn't answer. Frank knocked again. "Dean, open up. I know you're in there." The door opened. Dean was in a t-shirt and slacks, hair uncombed, cigarette in his hand. He looked tired. Frank pushed past him into the room and said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Dean closed the door and said, "Tell you what." Frank said, "The carousel, the partnership, the guy from the party. Why didn't you tell me?" Dean took a drag on his cigarette and said, "Because it's my business, Frank, not yours." Frank said, "Don't give me that. You gave him the carousel because of me, because of what I said." Dean didn't answer. Frank stepped closer. "Dean, I'm asking you, did you give up the carousel to get me out of that room?" Dean looked at him. His eyes were calm, but there was something underneath, something Frank had never seen before. Dean said, "What do you want me to say, Frank? You want me to say I sold out my dream so you could walk out of there alive?" "Yeah, that's what I did. You happy now?" Frank's voice broke. "Why didn't you let me handle it?" Dean laughed, short and bitter. "Handle it? Frank, you were about to get yourself killed. You think you can joke your way out of a guy like that? You think charm works on everyone?" Frank said, "I would have figured something out." Dean shook his head. "No, you wouldn't have. And I wasn't going to stand there and watch it happen." Frank sat down on the edge of the bed. He put his head in his hands. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know he'd do that. I didn't know you'd—" He stopped. His shoulders were shaking. Dean stubbed out his cigarette and sat down next to him. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Finally, Frank said, "I'll fix it. I'll talk to him. I'll get the carousel back for you." Dean said, "You can't. It's done. The papers are signed." Frank said, "Then I'll buy you out. I'll give you the money. We'll start something else, something bigger." Dean said, "Frank, stop." Frank looked at him. Dean said, "It's not about the money. It's not about the carousel. It's about the choice I made. I made it. I'd make it again. So just let it go." Frank's face crumpled. He leaned forward and Dean thought he was going to stand up and leave, but instead Frank put his arms around Dean and held on, and Dean realized Frank was crying. Actually crying. The kind of crying that doesn't make sound, but you can feel it in the way someone's breathing. Dean didn't move. He just sat there and let Frank hold on. And after a while, he put his hand on Frank's shoulder and said, "It's okay, Pally. It's okay." They sat like that for a few minutes, and then Frank pulled back and wiped his face with his sleeve. He said, "I don't know how to pay you back for this." Dean said, "You don't. That's not how it works." Frank said, "Then how does it work?" Dean stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the strip, the lights just starting to come on in the late afternoon. He said, "You just don't make jokes about guys like that anymore. That's how you pay me back." Frank nodded. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned back and said, "I love you, you know that?" Dean didn't turn around. He just said, "Yeah, I know." The carousel opened 6 weeks later. It was beautiful. Red velvet booths, brass fixtures, a stage big enough for a full orchestra. Dean's name was on the door, but everyone in Vegas knew who really owned it. Dean performed there 3 nights a week for the first year, and people came from all over to see him. Frank came every opening night and sat at the same table near the stage. He never made jokes about the silent partner. He never asked Dean if it was worth it. Notice what Dean did with his hands during the carousel's grand opening, because when the applause started and the crowd stood up, Dean's hands were shaking. Just slightly. Just enough that if you were standing close, like Frank was, you'd see it. Frank saw it. He reached over and squeezed Dean's shoulder, and Dean's hands stopped shaking. They stood there together while the crowd cheered, and Dean thought about the night in the back room, the handshake, the deal, the choice. He thought about what he'd given up and what he'd saved. He thought about Frank crying in his hotel room and the way Frank looked at him now, with something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Respect, maybe, or understanding, or guilt. Dean never regretted it. Not once. That's what he told himself anyway, late at night when the carousel was closed and he was alone in his dressing room, looking at the partnership papers in his desk drawer. He told himself it was worth it. He told himself Frank was worth it, and most of the time, he believed it. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. Years later, after the carousel closed and the partnership dissolved and the man in the dark suit moved to Miami and never came back, Frank asked Dean if he ever thought about what might have happened if Dean hadn't stepped in that night. Dean said, "Every day." Frank said, "What do you think would have happened?" Dean looked at him and said, "I think I would have lost you, and I think that would have killed me faster than any bullet." Frank didn't say anything. He just nodded. They never talked about it again, but every year on the anniversary of the carousel's opening, Frank sent Dean a bottle of Jack Daniels with a note that said, "For the smartest choice either of us ever made." Dean never corrected him.